That guitar isn't for people like you." The words cut through the air-conditioned silence of Blackwood Luxury Instruments like a serrated knife. Every head turned, every conversation stopped. The elderly man's weathered fingers, inches away from the polished mahogany of the limited edition Soul Weaver guitar, froze mid-reach. His eyes, still bright blue beneath unruly silver eyebrows, widened with shock, then narrowed with a pain too deep for words. In that moment, no one noticed the man in dark sunglasses near the champagne table slowly lower his glass. The launch party of Blackwood's Soul Weaver limited series had transformed the boutique into a glittering museum of wealth and prestige. Crystal chandeliers cast diamond-like reflections across display cases holding instruments priced higher than most cars. Journalists mingled with celebrities, collectors with producers, everyone dressed impeccably, everyone except the old man in the faded denim jacket covered with patches from music venues long closed. The store manager, Elliot Winters, stood between the old man and the guitar. His tailored suit, as sharp as his smile, was cold. Behind them, several guests had already raised phones to record what promised to be an entertaining confrontation. "These instruments are investments, sir, not toys for street performers," Winters continued, making no effort to lower his voice. "Perhaps there's a pawn shop downtown more suited to your budget." Laughter rippled through the crowd, nervous, guilty, cruel. The old man's shoulders slumped, but his gaze remained fixed on the guitar, as if seeing beyond its present gleam to some distant memory. He hadn't noticed how the sunglassed figure had begun moving through the crowd toward him, nor how the whispers had started. "Is that Johnny Depp?" But everyone would remember what happened next, a moment that would be shared across every social platform within hours, teaching a lesson about respect, music, and the true value of instruments designed not to be displayed, but to sing with soul. Thomas Reilly had walked past Blackwood Luxury Instruments every Tuesday for 5 years, occasionally pausing to gaze through the window at the masterpieces inside, never entering. Today had been different. A small sign announcing the launch of the Soul Weaver series had stopped him cold on the sidewalk. His calloused fingertips had traced the announcement through the glass, leaving smudges the shop assistant would later irritably wipe away. The Soul Weaver, his Soul Weaver. The guitar he had helped design nearly 40 years ago when he still had a name in the industry, before alcohol, bad management, and worse luck had relegated him to subway platforms and street corners. He hadn't planned to come inside just to look, but something pulled him through those intimidating glass doors, past the security guard who eyed his worn clothes with suspicion, into a world that had once been his. Winters, the manager, had spotted him immediately. "Can I help you?" The words carried a clear subtext. "You don't belong here." But Thomas barely heard him, moving as if in a trance toward the display where 5 Soul Weavers gleamed under perfect lighting, each instrument priced at $75,000, each bearing the curves and inlays he had sketched on napkins in a recording studio kitchenette in 1986, working alongside Marcus Blackwood himself, each missing only the small hidden signature mark he'd put inside all the originals, a detail known to very few. "Sir, these instruments are not for demonstration without appointment." Winters stepped into Thomas's path, positioning himself like a sentinel before the display. Behind him, the party continued. Champagne flowed. Photographers captured images of celebrities holding instruments they'd never play. And executives discussed limited production runs that would ensure exclusivity. Thomas could smell the expensive cologne, the champagne, the polish used on the guitars, so different from the beer-soaked clubs where he now played for tips. "I just want to see her up close," Thomas said, his voice soft, but carrying a dignity that momentarily caught Winters off guard. The Soul Weaver was... But the manager had already raised a hand to cut him off. That guitar isn't for people like you." The proclamation echoed through the now silent room. Thomas felt the weight of every stare, heard the soft clicks of camera phones, sensed the collective judgment. In decades past, he had played to crowds of thousands, felt the worship of fans, signed autographs until his hand cramped. Now he was entertainment of a different sort, the old man being put in his place, the cautionary tale, the joke. One woman in diamonds and a red dress actually smirked as she recorded the interaction. Only one person wasn't watching Thomas with amusement or disdain. Near the champagne table, a man in sunglasses and a casual black suit observed with unusual intensity. Johnny Depp had come to the event at the invitation of a musician friend, with no intention of purchasing anything. He'd been half listening to the CEO's practiced pitch about investment value when the confrontation began. Now he found himself studying the old man, the way he looked at the guitar not with greed or admiration, but with something like recognition, like reunion. Thomas's fingers, which had begun to tremble slightly, curled into a loose fist at his side. He had played through broken strings, power outages, and once even a small fire. He had performed with a 103-degree fever in Helsinki and with a fractured wrist in Sydney. But this public rejection from the world he had helped build, tested a different kind of strength. The worst part wasn't the humiliation. It was standing 3 feet from the soul weaver and not being allowed to touch it, like being forbidden to embrace your own child. "These instruments," Winters continued, gaining confidence as he warmed to his performance, "are investments, sir, not toys for street performers. Perhaps there's a pawn shop downtown more suited to your budget." The deliberately theatrical pause before budget earned a ripple of appreciative laughter from several guests. Thomas felt his throat constrict, emotion threatening to betray him. He wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Depp set his champagne down and began moving through the crowd. Something about the old musician's expression had triggered a memory, a documentary he'd watched years ago about forgotten innovators in the guitar world, people whose contributions had been erased from official histories, but whose influence still shaped music today. He couldn't place the man's face exactly, but he recognized the look in his eyes. It was the same look his friend Jeff Beck would get when he held a particularly meaningful instrument, not ownership, but communion. The crowd sensed a shift in atmosphere as murmurs of recognition spread. Johnny Depp, actor, musician, collector, was approaching the confrontation. Phones raised higher. The audience had been enjoying the humiliation of the old man, but celebrity intervention promised something even more shareable. No one, least of all Winters, anticipated what would happen next, a moment that would transform a cruel social media clip into something that would touch millions with an unexpected lesson about music, respect, and the true worth of a creator. "Excuse me." Depp's voice, instantly recognizable despite its softness, silenced the room completely. Winters turned, his expression transforming from contemptuous authority to fawning recognition with whiplash speed. Several guests gasped. A woman whispered too loudly to her companion, "It's Johnny Depp." The phones recording the confrontation swung toward the actor, their owners suddenly conflicted about which subject deserved more attention, the humiliation of the old man or the unexpected celebrity intervention. "Mr. Depp, what an honor," Winters effused, straightening his already immaculate tie. "We'd be delighted to show you our collector's edition pieces. The Soul Weaver series is truly exceptional, only 25 being made. The craftsmanship is—" "I'd like to hear this gentleman's story first." Depp gestured toward Thomas, whose weathered face had frozen in an expression of cautious disbelief. The actor removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes filled with genuine curiosity. "You were saying something about the Soul Weaver?" Thomas hesitated, suddenly aware of the dramatic shift in dynamics. The crowd that had been silently cheering his humiliation seconds ago now watched with entirely different expectations. The woman in the red dress had stopped recording and was frantically texting someone, likely sharing news of the celebrity sighting. Winters stood frozen, caught between his desire to cater to Depp and his instinct to remove Thomas from the premises. "It's nothing," Thomas finally said, his voice carrying decades of resignation. "Ancient history." He began to turn away, dignity intact but spirit deflated. He had come hoping for one moment with the guitar that bore his creative fingerprints. Instead, he had found yet another reminder of how completely the industry had forgotten him. Depp stepped forward, positioning himself subtly between Thomas and the exit. "I've found," he said, just loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "that in my line of work, ancient history often turns out to be the most interesting kind." He extended his hand. "Johnny Depp? And you are?" "Thomas Reilly." The old musician's hand, calloused from decades of string work, met Depp's in a brief, firm grip. Something in the actor's demeanor, a lack of condescension perhaps, or a flicker of genuine interest, prompted Thomas to continue. "I worked with Marcus Blackwood from '85 to '87, helped design what eventually became the Soul Weaver." The shift in the room was immediate and palpable. Phones lowered slightly as confusion replaced mockery on many faces. Several guests exchanged glances, silently asking if anyone recognized the name. A distinguished older man in the corner, one of the few actual musicians present, narrowed his eyes in sudden recognition. Winters cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Reilly is—" he began, clearly scrambling to regain control of the situation, but Depp raised a hand slightly, a gentle but unmistakable request for silence. "The Soul Weaver design," Depp said thoughtfully, turning to look at the display. "The double cutaway with that unique curve at the lower bout. That was revolutionary at the time." He wasn't just making conversation. Genuine appreciation filled his voice. "And the sound hole positioning. I remember reading that it dramatically changed the resonance profile." Thomas's eyes widened slightly, surprise breaking through his carefully maintained resignation. "You know your guitars." "I play a bit," Depp replied with characteristic understatement, enough to appreciate true innovation. He gestured toward the display. "Which one is closest to the original prototype?" Thomas didn't hesitate. "The sunburst on the end. The others have minor changes to the bridge positioning that weren't in my original design. Looks prettier, plays slightly less true on the high frets." A few knowing murmurs rippled through the crowd from the handful of actual musicians present. Winters swallowed hard, suddenly realizing he might be facing someone with actual knowledge, not just another street performer to be dismissed. The woman who had been recording earlier now aimed her phone at Thomas with new interest, her expression transformed from mockery to curiosity. "Perhaps," Depp suggested, turning to Winters with a smile that was friendly on the surface, but carried an unmistakable undercurrent of challenge, "Mr. Reilly could show us what the Soul Weaver was designed to do." The request, polite but clearly not optional, hung in the air. Winters hesitated, trapped between impossible choices. Refuse Johnny Depp in front of a crowd full of recording phones? Allow the shabby old man to handle a $75,000 instrument? The silence stretched uncomfortably as everyone waited for his response. "Our insurance policy is very strict about demonstration permissions," Winters tried, his voice strained with fake regret. "I'm afraid that without prior arrangement—" "I'll take full responsibility," Depp interrupted smoothly. "And I'm genuinely interested in hearing the instrument played by someone who understands its soul." The word choice was deliberate, a reference to the guitar's name that wasn't lost on the listening crowd. Several people nodded appreciatively, already being won over to this unexpected narrative. Winters recognized defeat when he saw it. With a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes, he carefully lifted the sunburst Soul Weaver from its display. "Of course, Mr. Departamento, just for a moment." The emphasis made it clear he was only bending the rules for the celebrity, not the old musician. Thomas stood very still as the guitar was reluctantly extended toward him. His hands, which had trembled earlier with emotion, were now perfectly steady as they reached for the instrument. The moment his fingers closed around the neck, something visible passed through him, a straightening of his posture, a softening around his eyes, a subtle transformation that didn't escape Depp's notice or the increasingly attentive audience. "It's been a while since I held one of these," Thomas said quietly, his thumb running reverently along the edge of the body, finding the exact curve he had insisted on against Marcus Blackwood's initial objections. He settled the guitar against his body with the natural ease of someone coming home after a long journey. The fit was perfect. It had been designed, after all, to match his own playing position. The guests had formed a loose semicircle, phones raised again, but now in anticipation rather than mockery. Winters stood rigid with anxiety, mentally calculating the cost of any potential damage. Depp had stepped back slightly, giving Thomas space while watching with genuine interest. No one spoke. No one moved. The atmosphere had transformed from cruel entertainment to something entirely unexpected, a moment balanced between redemption and potential disaster, with every person present sensing they were about to witness something significant. Thomas took a deep breath, positioned his fingers over strings he'd helped select decades earlier, and began to play. The first notes of what would become a legendary viral moment filled the hushed boutique, pure, resonant, and carrying a lifetime of both mastery and heartbreak. The first notes that emerged from the Soul Weaver weren't showy or technically flamboyant. Thomas began with a simple progression, his fingers finding their way across the fretboard with the certainty of muscle memory that decades couldn't erase. The sound was crystalline, each note distinct, yet flowing into the next with liquid precision. 3 chords in, and something shifted in the atmosphere of the boutique. The murmuring stopped. Phones were still raised, but the people behind them had forgotten they were recording, captivated instead by the transformation occurring before them. Thomas closed his eyes, lost in a communion with an instrument that felt like an extension of his own body. The melody evolved, growing more complex, drawing from blues roots but expanding into something uniquely his own, a signature style that had influenced countless guitarists in the late 80s, though few present would have recognized it. As his confidence grew, his body language changed completely. Gone was the hunched, apologetic stance of the street performer expecting rejection. In its place stood a master at work, someone for whom the guitar was not an accessory or investment, but a voice. Winters watched with a frozen smile, unable to interrupt but clearly calculating the seconds until he could reclaim the valuable merchandise. Depp, however, had settled against a display case, arms crossed, head slightly tilted in appreciation. His eyes moved between Thomas's hands and the faces of the crowd, observing the collective shift in perception happening in real time. The woman in the red dress had lowered her phone entirely, her expression softened with something like shame. A well-known music producer near the back had pulled out his own phone, but not to record. He was searching Thomas's name, a furrow of recognition deepening between his brows. "That's the Soul Weaver voice," Thomas said, during a brief pause, his speaking voice stronger now, infused with the confidence his playing had restored. The original design was all about that middle range, making it sing like a human voice. He demonstrated with a phrase that seemed to hang in the air, resonating with an almost vocal quality. Most factory-made instruments now, they're technically perfect but soulless. We were after something different. Without waiting for a response, Thomas transitioned into a piece that started gently, but built with gathering intensity. Those with musical knowledge in the room began to recognize it. Blackwood Sunrise, the instrumental piece that had defined an era in acoustic guitar music, covered by dozens of famous musicians, featured in 3 major films. What most didn't know was that Thomas Reilly had composed it, though he'd sold the rights for a fraction of its worth during a desperate period. The producer in the back suddenly straightened, recognition dawning. "That's Thomas Reilly," he whispered loudly to his companion, but not quietly enough. "He wrote Blackwood Sunrise, played with Morrison and Dylan. Jesus, I thought he was dead." The ripple of realization spread through the crowd. Winters's expression shifted from impatience to confusion. More people began searching on their phones, finding old images of a younger Thomas on stage with music legends, credited on famous albums, mentioned in guitar magazines from decades past. The narrative was transforming before their eyes, from the humiliation of an old homeless man to the rediscovery of a forgotten master. Thomas played on, either unaware of or indifferent to the changing perceptions around him. The music had transported him elsewhere, to a time when his name meant something, when his creativity flowed unimpeded by doubt or hardship. His fingers, stiff from years of playing in cold subway stations, had loosened, finding their former agility. The soul weaver responded to his touch like a living thing, producing sounds that showcased every nuance of its design, exactly as he had intended when sketching its blueprints all those years ago. Depp moved closer, his expression reflecting genuine admiration. "The sustain is incredible," he said during a moment when Thomas paused. "You can hear how the body shape changes the resonance." Thomas nodded, pleased by the observation. "The curve here," he demonstrated without stopping his playing. "That was my contribution. Marcus thought it was too radical, but it creates a chamber that lets the note live longer." He played a high note and let it hang in the air, vibrating with surprising longevity. Soul notes, we called them, notes that breathe past their natural life. The final piece Thomas played was something no one recognized, a composition both melancholy and defiant, technically complex yet emotionally direct. Later, people would describe it as a musical autobiography, every phrase conveying a chapter of a difficult life. He built it to a crescendo that showcased both the instrument's capabilities and his own undiminished skill, finishing with a harmonic sequence that left the room in stunned silence. For several seconds after the final note faded, no one moved or spoke. The spell Thomas had cast with his playing held the room in perfect stillness. Then Depp began to applaud, slowly and deliberately, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. One by one, others joined in until the boutique filled with applause, tentative at first, then growing enthusiastic, punctuated with calls of "Bravo!" and even a sharp whistle from the back. Thomas carefully returned the guitar to its stand, his movements reverent. The transition was visible. As he released the instrument, he seemed to diminish slightly, some essential energy receding, but his eyes remained clear and direct as he turned to face the crowd, shoulders straight, with a dignity that no amount of hardship had managed to erode completely. "Thank you for letting me hold her again," he said simply, directing the words to no one in particular. "That was—" Winters began, clearly struggling to reconcile his earlier treatment of Thomas with the reality now evident to everyone. Before he could formulate a complete thought, Depp stepped forward. "That," he said, his voice carrying easily through the room, "was what music is supposed to be." He turned to address the crowd, many still recording. "We collect these instruments, display them in cases, treat them like investments or status symbols, but that's not what they're for. They're voices waiting for the right hands to make them speak." He gestured toward Thomas. "This man helped create the very instrument this event is celebrating. He knows its soul because he gave it one." The impact of his words was immediate. Guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, suddenly aware of their complicity in the earlier humiliation. The woman in the red dress had put her phone away entirely, her expression troubled. The producer at the back, was already on his phone, speaking rapidly in a hushed voice. Winters looked like he might be ill, the full implications of his mistake becoming alarmingly clear. Thomas stood quietly, neither seeking nor rejecting the spotlight now directed at him. He had come for one moment with the guitar that carried his legacy. He had received that, and more, a chance to remind a room full of people what music actually meant. Whatever happened next wouldn't change the essential victory of that moment. The Soul Weaver had spoken again with its true voice, and everyone had listened. "Mr. Reilly," Depp said, extending his hand again, "it would be an honor to hear more of your music sometime." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, devoid of the condescension or pity that Thomas had grown accustomed to hearing. "I'm working on a small project with some friends next month. Nothing fancy, just musicians playing for the joy of it. We could use someone who understands what an instrument's soul sounds like." Before Thomas could respond, the producer who had recognized him pushed forward through the crowd. "Thomas Reilly, Martin Beck, Horizon Records." He thrust out a business card. "I've been looking for someone with your sound for a documentary series we're producing. Authentic guitarists, not these computer-processed kids. We should talk." Winters, watching his carefully orchestrated event transform into something entirely unexpected, finally found his voice. "Mr. Reilly," he began, his tone dramatically different from earlier, "Blackwood Instruments would be honored if you would consider consulting on our Heritage series. Your insights into the Soul Weaver design are clearly invaluable." The naked calculation behind the offer was transparent to everyone listening, damage control rather than genuine appreciation. Thomas accepted Depp's words with a nod of genuine thanks, pocketed Beck's card without comment, and regarded Winters with a level gaze that made the manager shift uncomfortably. "The Soul Weaver doesn't need more consultation," he said finally. "She just needs to be played by people who understand what she's for." He gestured toward the instrument he had returned to its display. "That guitar isn't meant to sit behind glass or hang on some collector's wall. No instrument is." The crowd had begun to disperse, but not in the way typical of such events. Rather than drifting toward the exit, people had formed small clusters, conversations animated as they processed what they'd witnessed. Several were still watching recordings of Thomas's performance on their phones, sharing the videos with newcomers who had missed it. The story had already begun spreading beyond the boutique's walls. Within hours, clips of the encounter flooded social media. What had begun as potential mockery, the humiliation of an old man out of his depth in a luxury setting, had transformed into something entirely different. The narrative that emerged, shaped significantly by Depp's involvement, but carried by the undeniable power of Thomas's playing, resonated far beyond the usual celebrity encounter. "Johnny Depp helps forgotten guitar legend find justice," read one headline. "Watch the moment a homeless musician silences a room of elites," proclaimed another. The clip spread from platform to platform, accumulating millions of views overnight. Comment sections filled with discussions about the nature of art versus commerce, the disposability of artists in modern culture, and countless personal stories of musical instruments that meant more than their monetary value. 3 days after the event, Thomas sat in a small cafe, reading an email on a phone he'd purchased with an unexpected windfall. Horizon Records had offered him a position consulting on their documentary series, along with the opportunity to record some of his unpublished compositions. Another message from Depp's management confirmed details for the jam session mentioned at the boutique. A third email from a major guitar manufacturer proposed a signature model based on his original Soul Weaver modifications. What moved him most, however, were the messages from ordinary people, amateur musicians sharing how the viral video had inspired them to reconnect with instruments long neglected, music teachers using his story in their classes, elderly artists expressing solidarity with his experience of being discounted because of age or appearance. Thomas had never sought the spotlight, but now that it had found him again, he recognized the responsibility it carried. The cafe door opened, and Winters entered, spotting Thomas immediately. Their eyes met, and after a moment's hesitation, the manager approached. "Mr. Reilly," he said, the practiced smoothness of his tone unable to completely mask his discomfort. "I came to personally apologize for the other evening. My behavior was inexcusable." Thomas studied him, noting the calculation still evident behind the apology. "You didn't recognize me," he said simply. "Most people don't. That's not the problem. Blackwood would still be very interested in having you consult on—" "The problem," Thomas continued, as if Winters hadn't spoken, "is that you thought an instrument's value was in its price tag." He gestured toward the seat across from him. "Sit down. I want to tell you something about guitars that Marcus Blackwood taught me 40 years ago." 1 month later, Thomas stood in the back of Blackwood Luxury Instruments, observing a very different kind of event. Instead of champagne and celebrities, the boutique was filled with music students from local schools, each taking turns playing instruments that had been removed from their display cases. Winters moved among them, offering guidance with surprising patience. In the corner, a soul weaver, the very one Thomas had played, was being used by a teenage girl whose technique was imperfect, but whose face shone with the pure joy of creation. Depp, who had helped arrange the workshop through his foundation, stood beside Thomas. "You've started something," he observed, gesturing toward the scene before them. "Blackwood's doing these open sessions twice a month now. Other boutiques are following suit." Thomas nodded, watching the students with quiet satisfaction. The past month had been transformative, not just for his personal circumstances, which had improved dramatically, but for his sense of purpose. The viral moment could have been just that, a moment, a brief return to relevance before fading again. Instead, he had used it as a platform to advocate for what truly mattered to him. "An instrument without a player is just shaped wood and metal," he said, echoing words he'd spoken during a widely shared interview the previous week. "Its value isn't in how much someone will pay for it, but in what happens when the right hands bring it to life." He nodded toward the students. "These kids, they might not have $75,000, but some of them have exactly what that guitar needs, the ability to hear its soul and set it free." Winters approached, noticeably more relaxed than when Thomas had first met him. "The session's been a success," he reported, "and we've had inquiries about doing similar workshops from our other locations." He hesitated, then added, "You were right, Mr. Reilly. These instruments, they're different when they're being played, more themselves somehow." Thomas smiled slightly, recognizing the beginning of understanding. Perhaps Winters would never fully grasp the relationship between musician and instrument, that sacred exchange that transcended commerce, but he had at least glimpsed it. That was enough. As the event wound down, Thomas found himself drawn to the wall where the remaining soul weavers hung. His reflection in the glass looked back at him, no longer the forgotten figure from a month ago, but not quite the returning hero some had tried to paint him as, just a musician who had remembered and helped others remember what truly mattered about music. He placed his hand against the glass, a silent farewell to instruments that carried part of his legacy. He didn't need to own them to claim that connection. The true ownership wasn't in possession, but in creation, in having shaped something that would continue to speak long after he was gone. In a world increasingly defined by price tags and status symbols, that was the lesson worth sharing. The most valuable things we create are not those kept locked behind glass, but those set free to touch other souls. The video that had started as his humiliation but became his redemption had now been viewed over 50 million times. But its true impact couldn't be measured in views or shares or likes. It lived in every instrument taken down from a wall, every dusty guitar case opened after years of neglect, every moment when someone chose to see the soul of a thing rather than its price. Some legacies are written not in credits or contracts, but in changed perceptions, notes that, like those from a perfectly designed Soul Weaver guitar, continue to resonate long after they're played.